Welcome to the League of Women Voters Budget 101 session. We are delighted to have with us Senator Howell and Delegate Watts. Senator Howell is the senator of the 32nd Senate District in Virginia, which covers Fairfax and Arlington. She is the co-chair of the Finance and Appropriations Committee. In fact, she's the first woman to chair that powerful committee. And she has been a legislator since 1992 and is the longest serving female senator. Also with us is Vivian Watts. She is the delegate for the 39th district, and which covers Fairfax. And she's been a member of the House of Delegates, two stints, 82 to 85, and then she served as Secretary of Transportation, and then was reelected in 1996. And you will have to tell me, but I think you're probably the longest serving female delegate as well.
In the House, but Janet and I have been serving the same number of years if you total them all up. So there are three of us that share that number of years.
That's
Louise
awesome.
Lucas being the third.
Yeah, Louise Lucas.
And Delegate Watts is also, when the Democrats were in the majority, she chaired the Finance Committee, of which she is still a member. And I will turn it over to the two of you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and making time for us.
Okay, I believe I'm to go first. So let me just start by saying how pleased I am to be with you and to be with the League. Before I was in the Senate, I was an active League member out here in Reston. And I fully expect once I leave the Senate to come back, because I really am committed to the work you do and all the voter registration and so on, not to mention trying to stay up with all the issues. It's really a valuable organization, and it's one I want to be part of again. The couple of things I want to stress about the budget process. One is that it goes on all year. It's not just when we're in session, it's all year long. And the other is that the Senate and the House have somewhat different ways of looking at the budget. And Vivian is really familiar with how the House does it. So I'm going to stick pretty much to what we do here in the Senate. First of all, our budget, there are really two parts to the budget. One is non-general fund and the other is general fund. Non-general fund is money we really don't have much discretion with at all. It's things like tuition, flow through money from the federal government, transportation funding through the gas tax, for example. And so we don't actually, school tuition, I don't know if I mentioned that. We don't really deal with that at all. The other, though, the general fund is revenues from the income taxes, the sales taxes, the corporate taxes, and they're used to pay for things like education, public safety, healthcare, and that's where we focus our efforts. Just to give you a sense of how big the general fund is, for the 2 years that we just passed the budget for this fiscal year and next fiscal year, it's going to be a total of $58 billion is our estimate. And the way we divide it up, most of it actually goes to the biggest piece goes to public education. And that's 44% of the general fund funding goes to to aid to education. And of that, public education is 30% of the aid to localities. Aid to individuals is about 21% of the budget. State agencies, surprisingly, this usually surprises people, only get about 32% of the general fund, and we pay debt service a little less than 2%. As I mentioned, we work on this budget all year long. The Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee meets monthly. We get in-depth briefings. Additionally, our subcommittees, and we have 9 subcommittees at the moment, also meet during the off session, and they go into great depth trying to understand the issues facing the Commonwealth and to look at ways we can address them. We get help from other committees and commissions. For example, JLARC is one that it advises us. But mostly when you look at it, the budget is largely dominated by the governor. The governor is the one who puts forward the initial budget that's in December. And then we work off of that budget. We amend it, we put things in, we change how they're done, we take things out, but we use the governor's document as our working paper that we deal with. It's an interesting calendar on how we do this. It really starts getting active in August when the administration starts getting recommendations for their own budget. And in September, the agencies submit to the governor what they would like to have. Then in September, the governor and his cabinet review these requests. By December, the governor comes before the General Assembly and presents what his plans are, and also delivers to us the budget. And it is typically about that thick. And then in January, we get the budget bills, we review his proposals, our subcommittees meet, we come up with what our recommendations are. We pass it on the Senate floor with some discussion. We kind of discourage it, which is a big difference from the House, that they are much more engaged on the floor with the budget than the Senate is. By March, we're in conference committee because, like every other bill, they cross over. So we will make the House bill like our bill, and they will just lay our bill on the table, which means they won't deal with it at all. But when we get into conference, then we go really deep into it. And typically, there are 6 or 7 members of the House and 6 or 7 members of the Senate money committees that will meet in conference. We did it differently this last year. I don't approve of the way it was done last year, so we won't do it again that way. So at every point, really, there are opportunities for the public to participate. We have public, before we go into session, usually in December, we have 4 public hearings across the state. They're joint with Appropriations, Finance, House Finance, and then the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committees. The members come and we listen. We have constant input from community groups. I think virtually everybody tries to meet with anybody who tries to meet with us to get information. And once we're in session, we start getting amendments from members based on the input from the, typically from the public. They have to get their amendments, suggested amendments in by the Friday of the first week. So that for advocates means you really need to be doing your work way before. I mean, by November, it's beginning to get a little late. So it's constant. Let us know what it is you want. Line up somebody to put in a budget amendment. They all, at least in the Senate, Vivian can talk to the House, but in the Senate, we do review all of them. We have staff prepare on each and every one, and then we have to call through, and there are some very difficult decisions that get made in that. I guess that's the main ways I can think of for the public to inform us. We typically go to many events to listen to people. People come to our offices. We have different approaches as to how we deal with that, which is something that's always fascinated me. Excuse me. Some members are very restricted in who they will talk to in their offices. Others, like me, if I'm in my office, you can just come in and talk to me. The problem with that is I'm not in my office as much as I'd like to be because we're in committee meetings all the time. But if I'm there, come on in, and it works better than trying to set up a time, which probably can't be kept anyway. So I guess that's mostly it. I'm really interested in hearing Vivian's take on all of this. One of the things I enjoy about these encounters is we do get to talk to members of the other house. Surprisingly, during the session, there's usually not much time for that. I see you nodding. So Vivian.
Okay, so just staying with where Janet left off, you'd be surprised how little we get to talk to each other when you think about how business ought to be done. And here we are representing the same jurisdiction. And I don't think Janet and I have a chance to talk more than a couple of times a year. When we do, it's special. It certainly is from my point of view. And I also feel it is, as Janet and I sit down usually later in the day because we both respect very much the way in which we go after things. And I would say that that's very much what I learned in the League of Women Voters and stay with, that there's always something else to learn. There's always another view, another balance. And so when I decide that I really need to talk to Janet about something, I've really got it laid out, because I know as chairman of finance and appropriations, that is an incredibly demanding job. I, on the House side, am not so fortunate, and I'm going to lay it out that way. I mean, politics is politics. I would never thought that I would be able to be chair of finance, and I was only chair for 2 years, and how wonderful. I really got to dig in and do things, and then boom, gone again. And I will be commenting about some of the things about finance, because again, on the House side, we separate out the two: budget, as in appropriations, from raising the revenue, as in taxation. Whereas on the Senate side, they are both together. When I first entered the House for my first 4 years in the early 80s, Finance Committee was extremely robust. The lawyer who was the chairman, it was tax law, not 101, but at least 301, where there was tremendous issues of precedent and administration and oversight, and a lot of issues that have not been talked about, quite frankly, since, I'm going to say, 1920. Excuse me, I just got my years 2000, we got it. And that basically is one of the first things, and this is just reality speaking. I am not trying to be partisan, But when the Republicans took the majority in the House, one of the first things they did was change the membership of the House Finance Committee. And it has always had a majority of those who have signed the Grover Norquist no tax increase pledge. And that means two things from as I've witnessed it. One, Grover Norquist interprets any tax reform as being obviously reform means somehow you've got to restrike the balance. Well, that means something goes up if something goes down. And Norquist regards any reform as being a tax increase. He's always looking at what went up to balance out what went down. And so with that also, some of the members basically, it's only vote yes or no on taxes, not look at tax policy, not look at all the robustness of tax law. So with that, basically the last 20 years, to be honest with you, while I remain extraordinarily devoted to it, it really does not have the place that it should have in our public policy discussions. And when I say should have, let me just emphasize two things. Well, I guess three things. One, of course, we have to balance our budget. So everything that is done in the budget, the appropriations side of it, always has to be looking at tax revenue, what the economy is doing. And one of the problems in Virginia is that as we look at other states, we do not have a very balanced tax structure. 70%, I'm using round numbers here, 70% coming out of the individual income tax. Now, granted, about 20% of the individual income tax comes from businesses. As businesses have been restructured, many of them are not as corporations, they are as partnerships and subchapter S corps and so on. They're paying under the individual income tax. So when I say 70%, I'm including that in the 70%. Only 7% comes from the corporate income tax. However, our corporate rate is just about midstream nationally. So we are right in the mainstream, and it's much more whether you've got robust corporate activity than it is what the rate is. Our rate is right there in the middle. And then give or take about approaching 20%, sometimes is a little lower, 16, 17% comes from the retail sales tax. Well, the reason why this is a problem is that you've just got three sources of revenue, most of it individual income tax, and it's not very flexible when the economy changes. And so ups and downs come in depending upon the market as far as any capital gains and non-withholding taxes. So all of those things complicate the budget process. As Janet and all, I should really always say Chairman Howell. I've got to digress for a second.
That's too long for that.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I feel more comfortable. I'm Vivian. But my mentor was Dorothy McDermott, who was the first woman to chair appropriations. So there's always just a real thrill when I see women that are really deep into, quite frankly, what makes government run. So back to the point that I was going to make. So when we look at a surplus like we had for a lot of reasons I won't go into in this last couple of years coming out of COVID, we have to look constantly at the issues of what's going to happen with the economy. Janet mentioned that basically they're dealing with the governor's budget. Well, the governor's budget has a major element that I'm being round numbers again. Basically in September, he brings together a group of economists that are widely based, and they look at the projections of revenue. This is September. And they're looking at projections of revenue that will start the following July and for the next year, and in the biennial budget for 2 years. So you can imagine the kind of assessments that are going on as you're trying to look that far in advance, and again, have to balance the budget. And then you have another group that takes their recommendations of whether basically usually it's going to be soft, robust, or somewhere in between, to where the chairman of the money committees in the House and Senate, and as well as about 24 representatives of a wide variety of business activities, so we can benefit from what they're tooling up. What do they expect in the economy in the next year and a half, 2 years? And out of that then comes your projections that the governor is basing the revenue on. All of the appropriations have to tie in with that revenue picture, and that's where you start. Now, during the General Assembly session itself, it is both a true exercise, but it's also a bit of a game where you always relook at those revenues, and somehow you always project additional revenue so that the legislature has some additional money in exercising its priorities over and above the basic layout of the budget. So on the House side, then, when you take that background, one of the reasons why the House debates the budget much more on the floor, but it's only about 4 or 5 hours, and the budget is yay thick with tremendous number of provisions, is because the budget controls a tremendous amount in public policy. Let me just emphasize 2 things. One, that's where the school funding formula is. It never gets debated. And I personally wish that the school funding formula was in the code so that we could have a separate debate on it. It is so important, all of the elements of it. And again, I'm going to say, don't get me started, but the basic share of ability to pay 50% real estate tax, 40% adjusted gross income, 10% sales tax revenue for each locality. That share represents the share that was developed 50 years ago, when there was far more of our population in cities with a broader tax base, when, again, the difference is significant. And those are the types of things that we should be debating, but they're in budget language and it never really gets talked about. The other thing that is very much a discipline within the House is called the Woodrum Amendment. And this has been around for decades. Chip Woodrum from Roanoke was the author of it. And basically it says, when you pass any criminal law that would enhance the prison population over the next 10 years, you have to appropriate in the budget that estimated increase in the cost of the prison population. Now, even in a tough on crime state like Virginia, it has really helped control the politics of, I'm going to lock them all up, into being much more responsible consideration. But the short side of that is that, well, let's say, particularly when it comes to the example would be sexual crimes against children. You look at that code section and it really doesn't make sense as far as the age of the child and the relationship of the victimizer. And if you were to change that, though, you have a track record of exactly what that would do to the prison population, versus come up with some new crime, you name it, whatever. And it doesn't have that track record. And oftentimes we find ourselves passing these, I'm going to do something about it bills that do not necessarily have the merit. But let me just, in respect for time and really looking forward to questions, basically in the House, most any bill that is perceived to have a fiscal impact statement, impact, and almost all bills have fiscal impact statements, get sent to appropriations. Some bills aren't even debated in the committee of substance, and they're sent right up to appropriations. So this is why you have the House members perhaps more concerned, because proportionally there's fewer of us on appropriations, about these are big issues. And they're all being taken out of committees of substance and moved over into the budget process. And then in addition to that, we've seen, let's say, in a number of the subsidized, the need for low-income housing and the issues having to do with perhaps tax incentives, the issues having to do with child tax credits, child care tax credits. All of these issues get swept up into the budget process, and you don't have the members with the same ability to have a good discussion about priorities. So at the very least, those amendments, those aspects of the budget that are debated on the floor, yeah, it's theater, but it is to emphasize, here are priorities that we think should have had greater weight than they do. I keep on saying this truly will be my wrap up, but I don't want to leave without also making this, giving this perspective. In addition to the fact that we have to balance our budget, unlike the federal government, and the fact that we don't have a balanced revenue stream that is more vulnerable to the economy. Also, one of the challenges in Virginia that has basically been there always, and that is the spread between wealth and poverty in the Commonwealth, both in terms of real employment opportunities and what that means as far as any of the programs that you're doing, but it also, we are second in the nation in the spread of cost of living, so that whatever you're appropriating in the budget, while there are adjustments, for example, in the school funding formula, when you put it through the local composite index, LCI, essentially the jurisdiction I know best, Fairfax County, gets less than 3%, gets about 2% differential, whereas a state trooper who is stationed in Northern Virginia gets over 25% adjustment to salary while being up here. So those are other issues that have to do with raising revenue based on cost of living, but how do you appropriate based on cost of services that are reflected in that cost of living? So those are some of the other context issues to the individual battles that we all embrace.
I'm not sure what's happening next, or if actually we've frozen. It looks like maybe that's happened. But
No.
just a couple of comments based on what Vivian said. You can see why it's such a joy to work with her. She really knows her stuff more probably than anybody in the House, for certain. And just a couple of things. One, she mentioned in passing the Economic Advisors Group to the governor that actually met today. He made a few comments and left. So much for that.
I only had 2 years on that group, and I found it to be most interesting as far as the breadth of perspective that it is designed to bring forward.
Right.
We do have some questions if you wanted to jump to them. And actually, I have a question. You mentioned, Delegate Watts, you mentioned the biennial aspect of it, but I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more as opposed, what is the biennial? When does the governor propose it? When can they be? What is the deal with the biennial budget of Virginia, in essence?
I'll start the answer, but I know Janet will fill it out. I'm going to start it again at 20,000 feet. The biennial budget is essentially a planning tool. You're laying out for 2 years what your spending flow will be and how you will carry forward some programs, how you may start with a pilot and so on. But for all intents and purposes, while the biennial budget is introduced, as Governor Youngkin will be introducing it in the second year of the governor's term, and then on the last year of their term, while it is introduced, the interim years, it's a full budget debate. It's with amendments, because again, I kept on emphasizing how far in advance you have to project revenues, as well as, of course, unanticipated needs. So we definitely budget every year, and the biennial budget being laid out as it has been traditionally is more of a planning tool.
Yeah, I agree with that. I view the biennial budget as the baseline for that 2 years, and then we adjust it the second year. And in fact, I find the second year just as challenging as the first year. So there really that much difference.
Carolyn asks, she said the state gave Virginia Tech, which runs the facility, $500,000 this year to study what it would take to move from its current location to somewhere else. And apparently this was a budget amendment allocating $500,000 to the study. She felt it came out of the blue. Is there some way, I guess she's asking, is there some way that we can look at or prevent or figure out when these huge budget increases are being asked? Where's the best way to talk about it, shall we say, with our delegates?
I'm not sure what that is in reference to. Are you, Vivian? I'm just not.
I can only, there's no way that I can picture, and again, since I'm not on appropriations, that I can picture that you're moving Virginia Tech to someplace else.
Okay, no,
But
no.
opening up a satellite campus, as in when Amazon, that was part of the Amazon negotiation, both Virginia, UVA, and Tech have graduate programs that are located at the Amazon site. So that's a satellite site. So I can see a satellite site rather than say opening up a new university. Certainly that was something that George Mason got started by a branch of UVA.
Yeah, I think she's talking.
That's more the accurate description of what's happening, but that's just reaction, not knowledge.
Yeah, she's just saying when someone inserts a large budget amendment that profits one district, what can you do? You have to do what you do in any other bill, I would gather, is try to defeat it. There's a question, when you talk about education expenses, does that include colleges as well as local public schools?
When I was talking about it, I was only talking about the school funding formula and that determines the state share of K through 12 education as well as a preschool. So that's what I was referring to, is that state local share, where there's tremendous debate about whether or not the state share is being upheld, as some would argue it was determined to be 55%. It's been a long, long time since that's been true. The gamesmanship of we're spending more on education than ever. Well, per pupil is another picture versus actual dollar amounts being spent, but then also how everything is funded, of support personnel and transportation, et cetera. And if I can take 2 more minutes, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but I want to also bring forth from my finance hat on, when Governor Northam proposed and Governor Youngkin this was something they both strongly agreed on, as the legislature had for years, doing away with the tax on groceries. The problem was that the 1 cent of the state retail sales tax ever since 1966, and I emphasize that this was in reaction to, finally in about 64, the court saying you cannot close your schools rather than integrate. You have got to open up public schools. And then interestingly, 66 was the very first time that the legislature was apportioned somewhat on population, not strictly one man, one vote, but far different from what had been the representation before. So you had urban voices that you hadn't had before in the decision in 1966 to enact a retail sales tax. And from the get-go, Godwin said 1 cent of it will go on a per school age population in each locality, not attendance and membership, but for every child who lives in that county or city, making the statement that our obligation is to support public schools. You can choose to put your children someplace else, but we are funding public schools. And the reason I get into that degree of history, it is that important. It really is. And so that when you took, give or take 20% away from that 1 cent by no longer taxing groceries, this was a major change in the funding stream going to localities. So appropriations in particular, I certainly did everything that I could from the chair that I sit in, which is just a little stool to the side, but doing all I can anyway, to really bring out the importance in how you could go into the code and make sure that this backfill of that 20% was an ongoing guarantee and would not be subjected to other budget priorities. It has always been earmarked, and the concern was to keep it earmarked. And I think we pretty much, we might have to do a tweak in the language, but we pretty much did accomplish that. But it wasn't straightforward and easy. It took some real thought to make sure that it had all the aspects that it needed. And then, of course, Janet, if she wishes to, can talk about that 1 cent local sales tax that also continues on food rather than taking away that revenue.
Yeah, that was a pretty major battle, actually. It was something the governor had wanted, and we saw, as Vivian has said, how detrimental that would be to our public school systems. So we resisted it and pretty much succeeded. But it's, you know, I don't know how to be diplomatic about this, but there are reasons some people are Democrats and some people are Republicans. And it's just different priorities. And where they tend to play out, other than criminal justice, is in the budget. And the budget is, in my opinion, the statement of what we value. So it gets quite contentious. Now, I'm feeling fortunate that my counterpart in the House, Barry Knight, is actually a decent person. We disagree a lot on priorities, but we can work together. And in the past, there has been real problems between the chairman of House Appropriations and the Senate committee, to the point that I can remember one year where they were so mad they were belly bumping each other. They were up against each other so fat, screaming in each other's faces. But it became quite an episode. And I remember another time when one of the House conferees was so angry. I mean, I thought he was going to have a stroke or something. He was so beet red and pounding his hands. And I'm just glad I got a chairman I can work with who is reasonable and we can argue. And this year, of course, it went on for a very long time because of largely the tax policy implications of the budget, because they set in motion how much money we'd have to spend. So it was sort of circular in a sense. But we were able to come to some accommodation, although it did take several months.
Thank you. Linda asks if you could explain the rainy day fund.
Oh, that's something required by the Constitution. It came under, I think, the Wilder administration. He was the one that started that. And when we have excess funds, we have by formula have to put some aside that can be used also by formula when our revenues decline. Now, one thing we have discovered is that that's pretty limiting and it's in the Constitution, so we have to follow that. But we found other ways to put money aside. I like to think of it as, so we sort of park the money and we're putting them in reserve funds that don't have those limitations. So if we need it, we can access it. We're also putting large sums into the retirement system, which has been underfunded. And so we're putting money in that, trying to get to the funded amount quicker, which actually saves us money in the long run. But also it is a place where, if necessary, in a really serious decline, we could take some money out again. It's adding our flexibility.
And I would just add two things that I've noted from and that is one, when Janet said the limit on the constitutional rainy day fund, essentially you can only tap it if your revenue projections that you made when you adopted the budget are below a certain amount. So it's very, very specific. And then so that Virginia, which has had its AAA bond rating since bond rating started, is always very concerned about keeping that bond rating, both because of the money savings that it represents, but also the reputation of being well governed that the AAA bond rating represents. And the AAA bond rating bond agencies had two problems with Virginia. One, both of them are what Janet has just talked about. Are you properly funding your pensions? We're not sure that you really are. You've got to do better. But they also said, and I had checked those stats, that we were in the middle of the pack of other states as far as our revenue reserves. We did not have robust revenue reserves. And so this is why additional money has been set aside in reserves that is far more flexible in its usage for things that come up. I'm going to just throw out, let's say, major problems with staffing mental health hospitals and having people backed up in local jail because we don't have the staff to open up a wing of the hospital.
Thank you. Deb asks, it can be difficult to follow the budget process during the session. What is the best way to stay informed and provide support and or opposition to line items?
You just got to read it.
Learn how to word search the budget. This is a whole new thing that once I discovered it a few years back, I think, hey, I could actually find something in the budget. So it is totally word searchable. And you might be surprised at what's in there, so that at least when you do actually catch a member and can talk to them, you can be more specific about what really concerns you. So that is just a new wrinkle. But as Janet highlighted in her opening remarks, it's year round. So if you really want to make the case for well, I could go nursing homes up one side, down the other staffing. But if you want to make the case for what a personal care person has to do for a toddler who's on who needs to be on a breathing apparatus or whatever it may be, pick and choose, but you make those cases during the year. And the same thing goes for environmental issues and other things where you want people to have hands-on understanding of what these programs mean on the ground.
And I would just add, that was really great, Vivian. Good description. I would just add that by being part of groups that advocate on certain issues, you can stay better informed, and you can, and they have access to us. Even when
There's a question from Denise regarding the budget amendment 33 on lab schools. How will this get funded since 34 did not pass, which was the funding piece?
I mean, that's my concern. Where is he going to get this money actually to do this? Because it did not pass at the time. So that's my only concern. So I'm going to be quiet and listen to you wonderful ladies.
the Senate is opposed to the lab schools, basically. We have been resisting funding them at all. And I think we're likely to continue in that posture.
And
Can he still
And
money? Okay.
that's a big thing with the governor. So, I mean, you know, there are real disagreements going on, and this is one of the bigger ones.
Absolutely.
As Janet mentions, the governor and this kind of priority, throughout everything that we've said, Virginia is unique in having a one-term governor. So a one-term governor can come in and decide he's going to spin this initiative, or he's going to lower this tax or whatever, and not have to live with it. The car tax is a wonderful bumper sticker example. And certainly when COVID hit, and I began looking really hard at revenue, what was appropriate for Virginia, assuming that we might be in a real economic crisis, which is different from an ivory tower, which is different from what works for Wyoming and what works for Florida. What is Virginia's situation? Kentucky, for example, has a really high retail sales tax, but they don't have an income tax. So it's all of these things, so that these latest great idea that fits on a bumper sticker can really be scrutinized when it comes to budgeting. So when it comes to the lab schools, some of the big concerns in the House side are, you start some of these things and where's your oversight? We have had university attached to public universities where you have ongoing accountability. We've had lab schools, but if you turn them open to anybody who wants to put out a shingle, how is that different from some of what we've been hearing of the one aspect of the problem of student debt, where private universities promised them the moon, and oh, well, you can just borrow to get your education, and then the education wasn't worth it. And so these are all the concerns that are expressed in the House about the accountability, and why can't we just go with what we currently have and just robustly look at what we can do better in public education, rather than assuming that public education can't do it.
So at another time, I will ask you ladies, where is he, if he can steal the funds from the G3 grant or anything like that, I'm just concerned, but you don't have to answer that now. I
So we
just
need
want
to
to move
move.
on.
Joan McDermott is asking, how can setting nursing home staffing standards be paid for? Virginia is one of 12 states with no staffing standards.
Vivian, that's your issue, and it's been your issue for 30 years.
For 20 years, I
Okay.
have been at this. And the stat was absolutely right on. We don't have strict care staffing standards. And let me give you another perspective. Virginia has emphasized aging at home. If you're emphasizing aging at home, it means that the 60 to 2/3% to 2/3 who are in the nursing homes on Medicaid really can't take care of themselves. They can't perform at least 2 functions of daily living, feed themselves, get up and go to the bathroom. Staffing becomes all the more critical if you're going to both save money as well as quality of life by emphasizing aging at home. But when you're in the nursing home, so this is where this year, this last 2 years has been more of a coalition. It's not just coming out of the baby boom generation beginning to realize the reality of nursing homes. It's also, I think, finally penetrating that all of that work to expand Medicaid. Well, these are the same people. They're in nursing homes now. And we need to provide that basic direct care. Where does the money come from? Well, when you ask about, in my ideal world, anyone that talks about any major program would also talk about it, and I'm willing to pay for it. Because that's the bottom line. And again, I get all this advocacy and not how you pay for it. So at least 10 years ago, if not more, the legislation I've introduced has included a reinstatement of Virginia's estate tax parallel to the federal tax. And the federal estate tax has survived both the Bush tax cuts as well as the Trump tax cuts. It still is a basic way of taxing the high income wealthy people. 70% typically of their estate is in capital gains, non-tax that have never been taxed. So it's not double taxation, because once those capital gains pass on to the next generation, they pass on at current value, not at the original value. So no one has ever paid taxes on that. Again, the capital gains of that investment or property. The way I typically say it in groups is, Dave and I, if we're lucky, will still have a couple of 401ks that we haven't cashed in before we die. But every time we cash in, we're paying, it's a tax incident. And this is what is not happening. So if you were to put the same provisions that the feds have, which excludes family-owned businesses and farms and so on, and basically we're looking at over $25 million estate of a couple before you would trigger it. So we're not talking about only about 30 estates a year would qualify for this, and the revenue coming in would be about in the range, I've seen it from 70 million to 120 million, so it's quite a range. But the point is that it could cover those 30 estates. Elderly people could cover 30,000 in nursing homes. Who, again, do not have basic staffing to get up and go to the bathroom in the morning, waiting until 10 o'clock, or having food shoveled in, or not being able to open up their own food. So this is essentially, and the cost, because if we up staffing standards, we have to up our Medicaid payment, and our share, if you were to up them, which is a real minimum, but we would have to phase in because of staff availability. Round numbers, if you required 2.5 hours of direct care for every 24 hours, that would be about $25 million extra for the state. 40 million if you're talking about closer to what's recommended, 4 hours of direct care per day. So this is the ballpark range, but this would be an adequate stream of money that could fund it. And I think it has just very appropriate equity as far as the level of estate value that I am referring to, and the fact that the precedent is there on the federal level.
One thing I
Great.
would like to just mention briefly is I have put into the budget that we're going to have a study on how to make our tax system more progressive in Virginia. And I think that fits in to some extent with what Vivian was saying. I think it's really important that we move that way. We made some progress actually in the budget in terms of changing the standard deduction and a few other activities that will make it a little bit fairer to our lower income workers. But I'm adamant that we find out how to make it more progressive. And part of that, again, will go back into, at the end, the estate tax will have to be a piece of that.
And two things to add to that. Next Monday, JLARC will be receiving a report, which I was asked for in a resolution 2 years ago about the Virginia's individual income tax and its elements. I'm going to be honest and say, unlike in past years, which obviously I prefer, when you were patron to study, you got to participate in the study. And I have no idea what JLARC is going to be saying. I just know that I will be there and be scrubbing every aspect of what they get into, because there's so much in income taxes that people just don't understand. We magnificently gave teachers $300 deduction for supplies that they buy. Well, that boils down to about $17 in pocket, because it's a deduction rather than a credit. All of those issues will also be part of the JLARC study. And the JLARC has done some good work in the past. I'm going to bring up one that they mentioned back in 2012, and a number of members have introduced legislation. I have, but also Republicans, and that is to look at another way we're very different from other states, is that we don't tax services. And JLARC pointed out back in 2012 that the average family spending in 1970 went more to services than goods. And so here we are still today taxing the laundry soap, but not the cleaners. And most states do tax services. We do not. This would be a way of balancing out more retail sales taxes rather than the overdependence on the income tax that I mentioned before, but it also would be oriented towards those who have more discretionary income to spend on services. A lot of exclusions have to be there, obviously medical and so on and so on, and I won't go into that. But I did introduce a bill at the end of last session if you would like to spend go to sleep some night reading the details.
Okay. Linda Rice would like to know, how do you all receive feedback from the Deeds Commission with regard to behavioral health funding needs? What's the mechanism?
Well, my answer is that I have found that, and we've had all kinds of turnover of leadership, and that's been most unfortunate in agency. But the crisis is so bad that I have felt that we've gotten good input from the agency saying, here we are in crisis. We cannot overcrowd our mental health hospitals. It's not safe for the patients. It's not safe for staff. We will lose more and more staff. We put in significant money for salary increases. We need to do more. We're not competitive. And Deeds Commission particularly is trying, but it's a slow progress to get real community services so that both you can prevent as well as give people the support so that they don't languish in mental health hospitals without being able to lead a productive life.
I'm really fortunate that Cree Deeds is actually on my committee and is very active and advises us constantly on ways we can help the situation. I'm also on the Deeds Commission. I think we have actually accomplished a lot of the goals that we set out. I guess it's been about 8 years now. And I'm encouraged. Unlike Vivian, I haven't had much contact with the current administration's people in charge of the mental health system. And I'm, looking forward to more contact.
We are at 8 o'clock. Could we prevail on you for a couple more minutes? We have 2 more questions, or do you have hard stops? I mean, we don't want to take your time.
Okay.
Oh, you're sweet. Thank you. Lisa Sales says 2 things. She makes a comment that I think we can all agree. We need more women like you at the table to pull the power of the purse. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. And she has a question on nursing homes. Again, Voices for Nursing Home Residents reached out to Virginia Now to support nursing home staffing standards bills. Is there a line item in the budget or aspect of this that the state supports? What can we do? And who is the appropriate legislator to speak to about this issue? Again, it's the regulation and funding for the nursing homes.
Again, I can't give you all the members of the coalition, but it has been growing. I have been particularly pleased that AARP has really put a lot of weight behind it, and this will help. I believe the Poverty Law Center is also engaged. And so that kind of coalition, if the league has the positions that would allow them to join a coalition, a lot of mainstream names would be important for legislators to see that this isn't just because so often, I digress to say that so often I have seen that when a loved one dies, that chapter in your life closes. And we don't have the ongoing advocacy, and or the sister is as old as the person who just passed, and you don't have the ongoing advocacy. So if legislators see a robust, credible list of groups that know the importance of this, that would be very helpful. Individually, on the House side, both Delegate Mark Sickles and Delegate Bobby Orrock are key players on the House side as to what will actually happen. I am concerned, and I will bring up one other competing issue. There's a lot of effort being focused on incentives to increase the level of care from basic. Well, that's fine if you've got a good mix of private pay patients. But if you're trying to run a nursing home where 60, 70, 80% of the patients are on Medicaid, you don't have the money to be looking at, let's just improve care at the top. I'm talking about the basic care for the 2/3. So that is something that in talking with Delegate Orrock and Delegate Sickles, you might get a sounding on. With both of them, given their position, I would suggest, again, if you have a league position that allows this, that you make it a league visit. that you have a delegation of 2 or 3 that's, this is what we want to talk about very specifically.
In the Senate, I think you'll be pleased to hear, I think Barbara Favola is the best person to advocate for this. She is very knowledgeable, very dedicated to these issues, and she chairs the Committee of Rehab and Social Services. So most of those bills will go through her committee at some point.
Carolyn asks, what prevents budget committee members from quietly inserting items that benefit their constituents to the detriment of others?
Members can try to introduce anything at any time, and then we rely on staff and our good sense to beat back bad ideas, and there are often some. One thing that is true is we are on such a tight schedule once the budget amendments are put in by members that sometimes they do slip through. I mean, you try to read them all out, but sometimes people are very clever and do get them through.
Word search, right? Okay, Deb, we are done with questions.
Thank you all both so very much for your time and your expertise and experience. I don't know if you have any closing statements or anything that you want us to know, but we really do appreciate your taking your time with us tonight and helping us through this challenging process for the uninitiated.
Thank you. If anybody wants to reach me, use my sendhowell@gmail.com address. I read all of those. If you send it to my district office, it gets screened. So just use the Gmail address.
And my address is still vwatts@arrows.com. Yes, it's Arrows, and that just shows how far advanced I was. And the account has stayed active. So vwatts@arrows.com.
Well, thank you both, and good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.